Hello, my name is Lynn Kennedy, and I'm an Associate Professor of American History at the University of Lethbridge. I'm here today to interview Amy Shaw, who is also an Associate Professor in History at the U of L, specializing in Canadian history. In 2018, Amy gave a public professor talk entitled A Devil May Care Sort of Swagger, A Case for Remembering Canada in the Boer War, which you will be able to watch via the link below. Today we're going to talk about some of the themes explored in this talk and how they related to her new projects and some contemporary concerns. So Amy, your public professor talk addresses Canadian participation in a war most Canadians don't know a lot about. Can you tell us the particular focus of this talk and why knowing about Canadian participation in the Boer War is not at all boring, but both interesting and important?
Okay, so yes, the war in South Africa, the Second Anglo-Boer War, was from 1899 to 1902. So as the 19th century was turning into the 20th. And it was between Britain and the Boer republics in South Africa, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. But this was kind of the heyday of British imperialism, and so the Dominions were drawn in as well. This was the first time that Canada sent a contingent to fight in a war overseas. My public professor talk was on Canadian responses to the war in South Africa, why people went, what they were thinking about. I look into why the bodies of those fighting was such a big part of the conversation during this conflict. And I talk a little bit about how the war has been remembered or not in this country.
Since you've given this talk, you've co-edited a book with Dr. Sarah Glassford called Making the Best of It, which looks at Canadian women in the Second World War, and that just recently came out, so congratulations. Can you tell us a little bit about the essays in this collection? Is there any connection between the themes of that book and your talk on the Boers? And also, are you working on any other new projects now that relate to these themes?
Making the Best of It looks at some of the things that women and girls in Canada and Newfoundland did during the Second World War. It's kind of a sequel to a similar book about the First World War that the two of us did together several years back. And I guess one of the themes that links it with the public professor talk is that I've always been kind of curious about what people are thinking about during wartime. What makes them go to war or make great sacrifices at home and keep on doing that for years or not? How do ideas about gender fit into that? And how does it work in terms of the relationship between governments and their citizens? And I guess in terms of other projects, one other project I'm working on right now that's just in its early stages, looks at people who claimed government pensions during the Depression based on their service in the South African War. So this is going to be part of a collection that's looking mostly at First World War veterans' pension claims. And I haven't got very far in developing this one yet. But one thing that's interesting to me is the way that the men applying have to prove their debility, not just that they're in financial need, but that their age and illness have rendered them unemployable. So it's like the other side of that focus on their physical bodies during the Boer War. Then newspapers were really steadily portraying them as sort of impossibly tall and handsome and healthy and active. That's what I talk about in the public professor talk. And they do this because that was kind of a way of showing how great Canada was for raising them. And now we have this on the other end, where they also have to make some very explicit point about physicality to prove their worthiness in another way. And I guess one other project, professors often have lots of different projects on the go, all at sort of different stages. Another project that I'm working on is with Professor Lynn Kennedy, a really exceptional scholar who's also here at the University of Lethbridge. Perhaps you've heard of her. We're putting together a collection on fat and the body in the 19th century.
Oh, go on. It is a very exciting project, in part because in the 21st century, fat has such negative connotations to the point that some people think it's a dirty word. But in the 19th century, attitudes were quite different. Can you tell us what this project is revealing about fat in the 19th century and what sort of things will be explored in this collection?
Fat in the 19th century is fascinating. Um, this was a time when attitudes about size and weight were in the midst of a lot of really interesting changes. And looking at some of the different ways this was expressed offers insight into ideas about race, gender, and class and age. It's a really interesting window into how society was changing. And we've got some great contributions looking at these ideas across the English-speaking world. We've got chapters on art and imperialism and measuring, which was new. This was a time when people didn't have scales at home, most people. 19th century exercise regimes, political cartoons, fat babies. It's going to be great.
So, your own chapter in the collection is tied back to the South African conflict and the soldiers that you were talking about in your public professor talk. Can you tell us more about what in particular you're exploring in relation to their bodies and fat?
My chapter discusses the interesting role fat plays in the Canadian discourse of the South African War, like how their Boer opponents were described as heavy and slow as a way of showing their lack of place in a progressive modern world. How much of this war was fought over and using food, with the soldiers trying to starve out the commandos by burning farms and looting livestock. And how, even though the Canadian soldiers were often sick and hungry, they were also so often telling their families in letters home not to worry about them by saying how fat they were getting. One letter, after detailing considerable hardship and privation, abruptly changes tone and says, "But don't worry about me. I am quite well now and free of sickness of any sort and weigh 167 pounds. Everybody says I am getting fat. I hope so. We have a baboon with us now and the boys say it's hard to tell us apart." So, fat as insult, but also as power, and fat as comfort. Lots of stuff that's been really interesting for me to explore.
Finally, we can't ignore the fact that we are talking today in the midst of several global crises, including a pandemic that requires us to chat virtually. Much of your work in the past has dealt with people, particularly Canadians, facing other crises, and especially the effect that these moments have had on their sense of citizenship. Are there any valuable lessons that you have drawn from your scholarship that you'd like to conclude with today?
I don't know about valuable, but this is a time of crisis that has a lot of parallels with wartime. We are being asked to make changes and, for some, quite significant sacrifices in the name of the larger good of the group. And like in wartime, how closely we follow these goals and directives is shaped partly by the relationship between citizens and those who govern them. Canada, in a general way, has historically been a little more willing to accept government and to think in group terms than the US, for example. And that shows in some of the responses to this crisis. Although, of course, we're very far from perfect and there's still lots of challenges. Now, like in wartime, there's been a search for external villains. And there's danger in times like these of increased racism and increased authoritarianism. But I think history does also suggest that good can come of times like these. The welfare state came out of the Second World War and the Depression. The civil rights movement of the 1960s was chaotic and sometimes violent, but it led to some important and necessary changes. And the way much of the world has got itself together to try to limit the spread of this disease says some hopeful things, I think, about the possibilities for alleviating some of the damage of climate change, another big problem that requires a worldwide solution. So I think history does give us some reason to hope.
Thank you, Amy, especially for ending on at least a slightly positive or hopeful note, and for helping us understand how history can inform us about both the past and some of the struggles that we face in the present. And thank you all for watching.